Welcome today. You'll see I've got my little thing in my ear. I've got Janice is out seeing a doc, and I need to be have my information on and available here if she needs to talk to me. Just wanted to let you know we're going to be talking about the big fat surprise. Dave Murphy got me started on that last week, and he got started on it because of an article from JACC, the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. It's about saturated fat. He and John Teicholz and I had a little conversation on this last week, and I recorded a video on it, and I'm going to go through the gory details. And again, it gets gory. This whole issue, what's the top diet for humans? As you know, I mean, I tend to get nervous when I start traipsing into that territory. It's like that old statement that fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Food epidemiology is one of those areas. It's a very dangerous area for, quote, experts. It's very muddy. It's unclear. It's a mess. It reminds me of the quote. You know, there's some people would say the quote comes from Otto von Bismarck. Others would say, and I always heard it came from Mark Twain. I heard that he said, those that respect the law and love sausage should watch neither one of them being made. What has that got to do with this? I'm going to drag you through the gory details, the failure, some of the frustration associated with the question of saturated fats in the diet. We're going to talk about that, and again, hopefully you won't end up with the headache that I have just from getting started on that. So that's today's feature, saturated fats, good or bad. Previous topics, we've covered type 1 and type 2 diabetes, how to look at that, how to differentiate. Not quite as many people were interested in those, but the ones that were interested were very emotional about it. Can we reduce plaque buildup? We did that a couple of weeks ago. That video has come out of the blocks with more views than any video in the history of this channel. People are very interested in the question, can you reverse plaque buildup? So the answer, I'll give you the short answer. The spoiler is yes, but there's also a but to it. It's yes, but, and I'll leave you in suspension for what the rest of that is. We've covered other things, fiber, do masks really reduce coronavirus transmission? We did a lot on coronavirus for a long time. We've got close to 100 videos on that. I got worn out on it, as did the rest of the country. And I got a lot of people, because of the political connotations that this whole thing took on, especially the lockdown. I got a lot of people starting to bomb the comment sections of our videos on that. But again, a lot of interest in that space. A lot of interest on nitric oxide. I covered that with Doug Thompson, who's a dentist focused on oral systemic health. We had an insulin resistance inflammation webinar yesterday. Had a lot of interest, had a lot of folks saying again, but my doc said I was okay. It looks like I've got full-blown diabetes, or I've got very significant insulin resistance or prediabetes, and I'm burning my arteries. I will tell you, this ends up being a feeder process for our care, our patient care, because people come in, they get this information, and they find out, I've got a little bit more of a problem than I thought I had. I need to get a little bit better care, at least to get over this hump. We've got a webinar coming up on something that's perennially a favorite. The second favorite set of topics beyond reversal of plaque has to do with supplements. And I've avoided supplements. Supplements are also one of those areas where I feel like fools rush in. I started, even up to 5 years ago, I was one of those folks that felt like, for the most part, supplements represented expensive urine. Then I got a little bit deeper. I realized the interest that was out there. I actually reviewed the science, and I walk away with, here's why you with some understanding on why so many people say that. The bottom line is, and even the supplementers should know this, you cannot supplement your way out of a bad lifestyle. There's no supplement, and there's no medication, there's no surgery either that's going to overcome 30 pounds of body fat that needs to be removed, that you're struggling with. But they can help. There's no question, and there's science behind the supplements. And so, again, I've continued to get a lot of interest and questions about these, about supplements. Michelle's been doing a lot of hard work organizing a webinar around it, and we've got that coming up soon as well. I keep giving updates on the book. I hope you're not as sick of the updates as I am of writing the book. We came a lot closer to a decision yesterday to not go with a large publishing house. It's, you lose control. It could take another 6 months or longer to get the thing out. We're getting close to just going ahead and self-publishing and getting it out there. The subscription program has come out of the blocks. It's been popular. A lot of folks are saying, you know what, it helps me get what I need to get. I'm getting ready to go into Medicare in a couple of years, and I don't have a trust level, a comfort level regarding the docs that I have for the prevention side. I've got a good cardiologist. He knows how to handle some of my problems. He thinks he knows how to handle the prevention, but maybe not so much. I'd rather keep my cardiologist, but get started with you, Doc, on one of the memberships. So that's the basics. That's the word from our sponsors, which is me. And as soon as Aspen gives us the break, the water ball will go into the next phase, the program on saturated fat. Go ahead. So, again, Dave Murphy got us started on this last week. Actually, he sent me the JACC article a couple of weeks ago. What are we talking about? The Big Fat Surprise. That's the title of a book. It was written by Nina Teicholz. We'll talk about the book in just a minute. That came out like 4 years ago. And just like, it's so interesting. As humans, we're so slow to learn really important stuff. You remember with this whole pandemic, the pandemic had been predicted many times. Osterholm, I think is it Michael Osterholm, wrote the book, The Most Dangerous Enemy, something like that. I read that book. I've covered it in a couple of videos. And he said, look, the coronaviruses are likely to create a significant pandemic because of some of the demographics, some of the habits around food and stuff. It's likely to come from China. And we did nothing to prepare for it. Same thing's going on with saturated fat. There's still a huge debate. Most people think saturated fat is really, really bad for you, despite continuing evidence to the contrary. Yes, I said it, and I expect a lot of haters to pile on because of that comment. The evidence is piling up on saturated fat, and we're going to go over it today. Now, why did it come back up? This book came out again 4 years ago. I think it was 4 years ago. We'll find out in the next slide. Will remind me. Here's why. And it's because, again, Dave Murphy responded to this article from JACC, Journal of the American College of Cardiology. Saturated Fats and Health, a reassessment and proposal for food-based recommendations, a JACC state-of-the-art review. So just to give you a tiny little teaser, at the end, we'll cover some of the basics on that state-of-the-art review. Basically, they said not only, it's not that they're just case studies, they're not case reviews, there are full-blown randomized clinical trials out there, a lot of them, And now there are even meta-analyses of those clinical trials, randomized clinical trials. You can't get more powerful than combinations of randomized clinical trials and meta-analyses of those. So we'll talk about those when we get a little bit closer to the end. As I said, any food epidemiology, whether you're talking about plant-based versus and vegan versus carnivore, low carb, paleo, keto, a lot of pain, a lot of emotion, and a lot of pain coming from the emotion, and a lot of heartfelt beliefs. But the science, the epidemiology, is pretty confusing. And again, I'm going to carry you through some of the things that we've seen in the past and lead up to the JACC article of a week and a half ago. Asking whether saturated fat is good or bad for cardiovascular health is looking for a simplified answer to a complicated issue. Dietary saturated fats believed to increase blood levels of LDL cholesterol. And a lot of people would say, does that really matter? We'll get into that. Subsequent risk for coronary artery disease. Since the 60s, dietary guidelines emphasized a reduction in consuming saturated fat. 2 old studies showing direct correlation. Hugh and Associates, 1997, in the New England Journal. Again, this is not a bad journal, one of the top 2 or 3 in the world for medicine. Quote, replacing saturated and unsaturated fats with unhydrogenated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fats is more effective in preventing coronary heart disease in women than reducing overall fat intake. And there you see the title of the article over on the right side. McGee and Associates in 1984 in the American Journal of Epidemiology, quote, men who developed coronary heart disease also had a higher mean intake of percentage of calories from protein, fat, and saturated fatty acids, SFAs, and polyunsaturated fatty acids than men who remained free of coronary heart disease. Newer studies are challenging this, though. Chowdhury and Associates in the Annals of Internal Medicine. Again, another quote, high levels of saturated fat intake had no effect on coronary disease. Monounsaturated, alpha-linoleic, and omega-6 were found to have no association with disease. Siri, Torino and Associates, 2010, American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Quote, during 5 to 23 years of follow-up of over 1/3 subjects, 11,000 developed coronary heart disease or stroke. Intake of saturated fat was not associated with an increased risk of coronary heart disease, stroke, or CVD. D'Souza and Associates, 2015, British Medical Journal. Saturated fat intake was not associated with all-cause mortality. CVD mortality, total CHD, ischemic stroke, type 2 diabetes. There was no convincing lack of association between saturated fat and CHD mortality. Schwingschakel and Hoffman, 2014, British Medical Journal Open. No significant risk of reduction could be observed considering all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality and other combined types of endpoints. Saturated fat is not a single entity. It's biologically complicated, and when you begin to understand what saturated fats are and how the biochemistry geeks look at different components of saturated fats, you begin to wonder how and why did they link all these things up. SFA, saturated fats, are saturated because they have no double bonds between the carbon atoms of the fatty acid chain. You see the carbon atoms here. All fats are made up of fatty acids. So this is stearic acid with what? C18, 18 carbons. Oleic acid with 18 carbons. It's monounsaturated because it's got a double bond right here. No double bonds in stearic acid. So it's a saturated fat. Linoleic has C18, but it's got 2 double bonds here and here. Again, excuse me. So you begin to see the differences between these saturated, polyunsaturated, and monounsaturated. Saturated, no double bonds. Monounsaturated, 1 double bond. Polyunsaturated, 2 or more double bonds between carbon atoms. That's what those things mean. Monounsaturated fatty acids, MUFAs, have one double bond. Polyunsaturated PUFAs, PUFAs, have two or more double bonds. So good sources for monounsaturated are fats and oils like canola, olive, and sunflower, nuts and nut butters, peanuts, avocados, olives, sesame seeds, and tahini. It's said that different SFAs, saturated fatty acids, vary in their effects on lipid levels. For example, stearic acid is generally excluded as it's considered not a cholesterol-raising saturated fat. Dariush Muzaffarian, Dean of the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts in Boston, said in an interview with Medscape, the U.S. view on saturated fats is totally based on the effects on LDL-C, LDL cholesterol. And that's why they have dietary guidelines to lower our saturated fat intake and why stearic acid is given a free pass. They don't affect just LDL cholesterol. They affect particle size, and they affect HDL cholesterol and triglycerides. It's not clear which ones are better or worse if you begin to look at all of those different effects. And for those of us who say, you know what, we're not clear how much the impacts on cholesterol are a big deal compared to bigger issues, that contributes to another major driver of this confusion around saturated fats. Marion Nestle, professor of nutrition, food studies, and public health at NYU, told Medscape, saturated fat raises LDL-C in comparison to the effects of unsaturated or polyunsaturated fats. All fat foods, without exceptions, are mixtures of the three kinds of fatty acids, saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. So it's not surprising that the effects of foods and diets can differ. The source of saturated fat matters, at least according to a lot of folks. What you replace saturated fat with also matters, again, according to a lot of folks. Now look at the MESA study. Higher intake of dietary SFAs was associated with lower cardiovascular risk, whereas a higher intake of meat SFA was associated with greater CVD risk. And here's the link, and here's the MESA, multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis. Very, very well-known study. That specific SFA was a side part of that study. And again, you get these large studies like MESA, you get a lot of offshoots of many studies that were done. Sometimes they create more confusion than they clear up. But again, it was a very productive study, created a lot of information, much of which we're still sifting through. The second bullet, a pooled analysis of 11 prospective studies of more than 1/3 healthy adults older than 35 suggests that consuming polyunsaturated fats instead of saturated fat lowers the risk for coronary artery disease, whereas replacing saturated fat with carbohydrates may increase the risk. Well, I think for most of the viewers of the channel, at least that second piece, replacing saturated fats with carbs, increasing the risk, makes a lot of sense. Now, the polyunsaturated versus saturated, again, don't overreact immediately. Continue to watch the preponderance of the evidence as it develops. The EPIC trial, another one of those large studies like the MESA trial, the EPIC trial conducted in almost 500,000 middle-aged adults from 10 countries found that processed meats were linked to cardiovascular mortality, but not red meat per se. More confusion, and confusion leads to frustration. Now, a lot of people would say, and I agree somewhat with this, stop emphasizing macronutrients, fats, carbs, and protein, and instead highlight real foods. I think there's reality to that. However, I do think there's a place. As I look at the overall risk components of the patient population that I see and the middle-aged population, given the problems associated with and the prevalence associated with prediabetes. I think number one, you need to make sure that you know whether you have prediabetes or full-blown diabetes. And then number two, if you cannot metabolize carbs, be careful about the sources and the types, and then most of all, the amount of carbs in your diet. It's not usually sugars that tend to cause the major problems, nearly so much as it is grains, breads, pastas. Astrup and Associates in JACC, June 2020. Although SFAs increase LDL-Cs in most individuals, this is not due to increasing levels of small, dense LDLs, but rather larger LDLs, which are much less strongly related to cardiovascular risk. We're going to go deeper into that study, the Astrup study. Whole fat dairy, unprocessed meat, eggs and dark chocolate are SFA-rich foods with a complex matrix and are not associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. We'll repeat that again a little bit later in a different context. Alpha-linoleic polyphenols and omega-3 fatty acids present in nuts, olive oil, vegetables, oily fish rapidly attenuate inflammation and coronary thrombosis. We've got a link for that. Nutraceuticals and anti-thrombotic agents. The Mediterranean diet, a big following for that diet. In comparison to a, quote, low-fat diet, energy unrestricted Mediterranean diet with 41% fat, supplemented with at least 4 tablespoons of olive oil or a handful of nuts. The PrevMed study, you may remember that. We've got a couple of videos on it. Achieved a 30% risk reduction in over 7,500 high-risk patients. These high-risk patients, you need to go back and look. This is not a statement that you just go to the Mediterranean diet. If you are your typical high-risk patient, going to the Mediterranean diet is an improvement. The Mediterranean diet, however, as you will see, has a significant number of carbs. And if you already know that you cannot digest carbs, then again, you can do better. Now, it's not just diet, obviously, it's lifestyle, and folks have to look at an overall lifestyle. A small study, single aerobic exercise session appeared to counteract the postprandial endothelial dysfunction induced by some diets. Diet is one factor that helps heart disease. It is by far the biggest. Not so much the diet and the macronutrients, but the amount of food that you eat. In other words, the body fat content. Body fat in and of itself is not an inert tissue. It's not an inert energy storage tissue. Obviously, brisk walking, exercise, high intensity intervals, stress release, appropriate sleep, all of those are very important. So let's get back to the big fat surprise and JACC's new take on that. As I said, it was a book written by Nina Teicholz. It was 2014, not 4 years ago, 6 years ago. The subtitle is Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet. It was a New York Times bestseller in 2014. It's a tome, it's long. Again, I did a few comments about it in several videos. I just retaped or re-recorded a video which goes into some of these details. 497 pages of details about the science, details about the history of this project, the personalities and the politics and the money that went into turning this into policy. And we'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. It won a lot of book awards, The Economist, Wall Street Journal, Kirkus Reviews, Forbes. Let's Eat by Barron's, Gene Epstein. The author skillfully recounts the tragicomic tale of how it's been possible for an ostensibly science-based culture to be so out to lunch about the food that we eat. You get his little pun there, out to lunch. Yeah. It's sort of like my pun about people that like sausage shouldn't watch it being made. People that like science about diet shouldn't watch it being made either. British Medical Journal, it's impressive. The book shook me. Teicholz has done a remarkable job in analyzing the weak science, strong personalities, vested interests, and political expediency. Mona Sharon, to eat or not to eat? That's the question these days. And for the past 4 decades, people have been told not to eat red meat because they're high in saturated fat. Washington Monthly, a remarkable new book, fascinating, detailed, highly readable investigative history of how some of America's most trusted scientific institutions went off the rails. This next quote is one of my favorites because it comes from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and it describes the arrogance that a lot of the professionals put into this place. We've all been arrogant. I've had my episodes specifically about this issue. I was low fat for decades and low saturated fat. This book should be read by every nutritional science professional as a guide to risks of hubris or hubris, depending on how you pronounce it, and to the consequences of basing public policy on belief as opposed to evidence of positive beneficial effects. All scientists should read as an example of how limited science can become federal policy. Teicholz compiled a historical treatise on how scientific belief versus evidence, non-government organizations, food manufacturers, government agencies, and moneyed interests promised more than they could deliver. And in the process, quite possibly contributed to the current worldwide obesity epidemic, and I'll add, and to the deaths and destruction and disability that have gone with it. So a big deal. The book's a big deal. So why haven't we responded to it? Well, there's been some response, but we'll talk about how much response. Here's a couple of quotes out of the JACC article, the article that came out this week, or 2 weeks, a week and a half ago, on the 20th. The recommendation, here's a quote, recommendation to limit dietary saturated fatty acid has persisted despite mounting evidence to the contrary. And here's one of the things I would say editorial-wise. You know, back 20, 30 years ago when a lot of this was happening, the science was not that clear. And you're continuing to go in a, the science is improving and the public policy is following it. But again, if you read that book, you get a clear understanding. People purported and put facts and science out there that just were not facts or science. If that's the first time you've ever heard of that, where have you been? Most recent, another quote from the JACC article, most recent meta-analyses of randomized clinical trials found no beneficial effects of reducing saturated fatty acids on cardiovascular disease. Third quote, although, and this is, we've mentioned this before, although SFAs do increase LDL, it's not the small dense LDL, which are more associated with danger. It's the larger LDL, which are much less strongly related to disease. So the conclusions were, again, quotes, whole fat dairy, unprocessed meat, egg, and dark chocolate are SFA rich. They're not associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. The final quote, the totality of available evidence does not support further limiting of the intake of such foods. So that's the story. What are the authorities saying now in terms of public policy? Well, if you live in the UK, the big authority there is the NHS, the National Health Services. And if you go to the NHS website, they start telling you how to eat less saturated fat. How about the American Heart Association? If you live here in the US, saturated fat, what do they say? Well, there's a lot of conflicting information. And should I eat them or not? Here's if you can see my cursor, decades of sound science has proven it can raise your, quote, bad cholesterol, or, quote, bad, end quote, cholesterol, and put you at higher risk for heart disease. So We've got a significant disconnect in terms of the science. You got the highest level of science just being quoted in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, the American Heart Association still saying it's bad. So where will we go next? How long will it take? Aspen, why don't you go ahead and play this, this next video?
Welcome to Morning Report, our 1-minute news story for primary care. Media reports about saturated fats like butter and red meat can be confusing. In fact, most Americans believe that coconut oil, another saturated fat, is good for them. This prompted the American Heart Association to issue an advisory on the harms of saturated fats. The AHA emphasizes that well-conducted studies show overwhelmingly that all saturated fats raise LDL cholesterol and increase risk for heart disease. They advise people to consume less saturated fat and instead use poly or mono unsaturated fats, such as canola, soybean, or olive oil. Other foods to substitute for saturated fat include whole grains, fruits, and veggies. We already tell patients to follow a healthy diet, like the DASH or Mediterranean diet. This AHA advisory fine-tunes that advice by telling us which fats to avoid and which to include.
So, as you saw, again, we're making a cut between first we had the intro where we talked about services available, then we had the program, and now we're making the cut into discussion. I have to tell you, one of the discussion points, one of the recent ones down at the bottom hit me. It's from Sax Girl Hornboy. I liked Teicholz until I heard, it just moved and now, okay. Until I heard her say that all vegetarian diets are high carb. It's like, really? I would agree with you, Sax Girl Hornboy. It's like, oh my Lord, one of the key things that I continue to have to remind my patients on is that you can go full keto, not low carb, but full keto on a vegetarian diet. So no, that's not true. All vegetarian diets are not high carb. They tend to be that way, but that's a very, very common misunderstanding. Thank you for bringing that out. So let's go back up. We've got a lot of people on. We've got a lot of interest. Swarndeep Singh. Several doctors says don't use coconut oil because it has saturated fat. A lot of people say that's Swarndeep. And it will increase LDL. And on the other hand, some says coconut increases HDL and decreases triglyceride. Welcome to our world. A lot of debate, and debate leading to anger on this issue. I've started consuming it. By the way, I consume coconut oil in a couple of different forms every day, or almost every day. You know, other people talk about a quote bulletproof coffee that they make with butter. I used to use some ghee in that, some of that really orange-looking ghee that you would hope has a lot of K2 in it. I've been using coconut oil more recently. I've been using coconut oil for a few months. Parker Reed, howdy from North Texas. How are you doing, Parker? Good to hear from you. Saturated fat, is it really that bad? Okay, Tom Schnell, another from North Texas here as well. Thanks for joining, and thanks for letting us know where you're joining from. We've got folks from all over the world that attend these. And it's fun and exciting to hear where you're coming in from. Hey, neighbor. Art Berry, higher triglycerides normal for type 2 diabetes. Well, it depends on what you mean normal. It's very, very common to get higher triglyceride values. Those higher triglyceride values lead to higher, what we call IDL. You've got your very low VLDL. There are things called remnant cholesterols, and those tend to be more of a danger. Cutting carbs in your diet does tend to respond to that component. So yes, as you get problems in metabolizing carbs in your diet, you start to see increase in triglyceride. That's dangerous. So, and yes, it usually does respond to dietary, to limiting carbs in your diet. I obviously, given what I do, I see people that where we've used Vesipa as well. That's that fish oil on steroids. It works, but nothing works like lifestyle. Parker Reed, doesn't the JACC article have sponsorship from the beef and dairy industry? Parker, I'd love to see that. I think that would be very interesting if they do. And I think that would be very interesting. Kelly Clover, my experience with coconut oil was bad. I found a correlation with much higher plaque too, if I included it in my diet. Kelly, thank you so much for sharing that. I have not tended to see that in my patients. Dilip Handor, resveratrol supplement is best solution in all respects. Well, good luck, Dilip. I think resveratrol clearly was, was discovered or put out there by David Sinclair, and even Sinclair has moved on. Resveratrol is part of that stuff that you tended to find. It got pressed for being what you heard about, people talking about the stuff you find in the skins of dark-skinned grapes. At the end of the day, they said, yeah, it does help, but you probably have to drink about 100 glasses of red wine a day to get what you need. So obviously that's a setup for a great joke, right? The other thing, the development is a lot of groups, a lot of companies are trying to develop a much more concentrated level of resveratrol. There are some groups that claim that they've got it, that they're doing it. I'm not aware of any significant scientific evidence out there about those concentrated resveratrol products. John Tocho, I hope you were here. We talked about you, and we talked about your components or your comments on the saturated fat article last week. Robert Simpson, good morning. Dennis Bolanos, could eating 4 eggs per day negatively impact one's health? Well, according to the studies that we're seeing here, they would say no. The other place where you talk about eggs, and it's one of the final planks in the vegans platform. They say that you get TMAO, trimethylamine oxide, from the egg yellows, the yolks. The answer is yes, you do, but it's not that simple. It's that same old saying. Here's the thing. TMAO does increase as a response of our bacteria in our colon and ingestion of food. They've actually done studies. I think one of them was in the New England Journal, and I covered it. I've covered a couple of videos on this issue. Look up Ford Brewer, YouTube, TMAO. And what they did, they actually did carbon radionuclide labeling of the substrate in the food, had the people swallow it, and then they noticed it within a couple of hours in the bloodstream. Now, here's the other issue. In a separate set of science, they found, quote, risk of TMAO levels for heart attack and stroke. Now, a lot of that science has gone by the wayside, and I think one of the key reasons why it has is this. Once you start teasing out that TMAO science, it does appear to be an issue for people with significant kidney disease. Most people with significant kidney disease already have major cardiovascular risk anyway. For the vast majority of us, those that don't have kidney disease, that TMAO risk factor tends to wash out. Now, I went down a long bunny trail about eggs. The bottom line, I don't think eggs are going to hurt you. Then Dennis, well, we got 2 of the same. Chuck K, eating pasture-raised eggs is great for your health. Well, thank you, Chuck. Thumbs up all. Well, thank you for the suggestion, Chuck. Guys, if you could do some likes. The here's what happens. When you share stuff, when you do things that show that you like content, if you spend time watching the content, if you give it likes, even if you give it dislikes, and obviously I'm not asking for dislikes, but here's what happens. The algorithm reads these things, reads these reactions, and they say, some humans really think this is interesting stuff. They're reacting to it. So if you could, go ahead and react to it. We would greatly appreciate it. Parker Reed, PubMed includes numerous articles associated with several SFAs with inflammation, in part due to the arachidonic acid component. Dr. Barry Sears, Zone Diet, warned about this back in the 90s. Thoughts? Parker? So maybe not so much thoughts about that specific component, and maybe that's a disappointment. I will tell you this. I was low fat for over 30 years. When I was training in preventive medicine at Hopkins and running the program there, that was, we had the Mr. Fit trial. I don't know if you remember that, but that was one of those studies that came out. It was one of those giant studies, tons and tons of people, tons of dollars. The NIH was not going to spend more money on that question again. And it came out very confusing. I remember sitting in many meetings talking about Mr. Fit and what were we supposed to do? So a lot of things just froze in terms of development of food epidemiology. And as you see, here we are 30 years later, we still have a lot of confusion going on. Do I think we know the whole story? No, we don't know the whole story. One of the problems with food epidemiology is that it treats all humans the same. And we know, I mean, you go back and you look at Eric trials, you look at the MESA studies, you look at some of these other more recent, really big studies, and they just look at humans. They don't know whether these humans are people that have insulin resistance, whether they have a problem, whether they have inflammatory bowel disease, etc. They're hoping that they'll get over it in terms of their numbers. They probably will in terms of inflammatory bowel disease because that's not that common. However, if you get to a point to where you make this transition with carb metabolism, where in our 20s and 30s, less than 10% of us have a problem with it. By the time we get into our 60s, well over half. In fact, if you go back to some of the newer data, you would say, actually, even by the time we're getting into our 30s and beyond, half or more of us are starting to develop significant challenges with our carb metabolism. So then you start to ask the question, are we really that similar? And, well, does the amount of carbs in your diet matter? Probably does. So again, that's why I said food epidemiology is a place where fools rush in, and maybe I'm foolish for even rushing into this space, but it's an item that many of us are very, very passionate about. The one critically important thing is what we eat in terms of lifestyle and how much of it we eat. I would tend to say how much of it we eat is more important. So to have so much confusion in such an important area is very frustrating, especially for people that do what I do. But if you happen to be a human being with a heart and arteries, it should be frustrating to you as well. Kevin McCord, Dr. McCord, thank you. He's a great preventive doc up in the Cincinnati area. Thanks for reviewing this important topic today, Dr. B. Great information. It's all about LDL particle size, particle count, ratios, and presence of oxidized LDL. He goes on to say omega-3, omega-6 ratio is usually way off in metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance. I hope that folks understood that. And I would agree, Kevin. Thank you so much for your attention. Thanks for joining us, and thank you for your comments. Again, if you're looking for a good doc in the Cincinnati area for prevention, Kevin's right there. Abdullah Ben Ahmed. Abdullah, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Could a cardiologist advise his patient who has a heart attack last month to eat saturated fat liberally? If yes, then can we say that saturated fat is good for health? Well, I think that's exactly what we've been talking about for the past hour or so, or 45 minutes, Abdullah. We used to say no. We used to give a clear and emphatic no. But those of us who focus on the science are beginning to have begun to ask the question, is that real? We're getting closer and closer to where the evidence appears to be piling up, Abdullah, that saturated fat is good for you. Sax girl, horn boy. That was the comment that I mentioned a few minutes ago. I've never heard her say that. I'm not a major Nina Teicholz follower. I will say the book was good. It was very good. When I write, as you can tell when I speak, I tend to get way too detailed sometimes in terms of the science. So I have a different audience, more of a geeky type of audience, science geeks, scientists. Teicholz's book was clearly written for the high school reading level, and it was a good book. She did a good job of touching on a lot of the science without getting too deep in it. Jonathan Lynch, eating cherries while I watch this. I wish I could eat cherries, Jonathan, and I hope you can metabolize those carbs in them. Because if there's one thing that I really miss and I love, it was this time of year and later, for the next couple of months, to get these big bags, fresh bowls of cherries. Oh, they were so good. I don't do that anymore because of the carbs associated with it and the insulin response. Tom Schnell, I've also observed Tina using the language that vegetarian diets tend to be high carb, which is, as you point out, an improvement as compared to saying all. I agree. Thanks, Tom, for sharing that. Sax girl, horn boy. I now think Teicholz is another dogmatic diet proponent who ignores inconvenient facts. I hope not. It would be interesting to see somebody go through 500 pages of examples on how that's wrong and then turn around and do that herself. I hope that's not going on. Oh, I hope that's. You're one of the few who genuinely endeavors to stick to the facts. Much appreciated. Well, thank you very much, Sax girl, horn boy. What that does is it makes you run the risk of seeming wishy-washy. And you know what? I'll just accept. A lot of people want to say, well, just tell me, can I eat fats or not? And I'll tell you, I eat fats. I'll tell you the science, and then you have to make your own choice. And if you're going to think I'm wishy-washy because of that, so be it. Elise Sufyan, how to find you? I'm unable to text you. Ali, you can go to our, send an email to myhealth, MYHEALTH, at PrevMedHeartRisk.com. Or you can go to our website, PrevMedHealth.com. In both of those, you can figure out how to reach me. Thank you very much for your interest. I look forward to hearing from you. A couple of times I actually put my own personal email out on this kind of thing, and I had to take it down. Jacob Benjamin Morris, do you take APO genotypes into consideration with your patients? I do. Actually, Jacob, it's a great question. I appreciate you bringing it up. There is a genetics lab called My Genetics. I did some postdoc work in genetics at Stanford and worked with the My Genetics group for about 5 years. Yes, especially if the patient has an interest in that space, we can and will get APOE. For those of you who are not familiar, APOE is one of the it's one of those areas that that manages lipoprotein particles, like cholesterol particles. LP little a is a genetic variation. APOEs, there are different families, A, B, C, D, and E, and a couple of others. In the E category of proteins that manage lipids, cholesterol levels, so you don't get big fat, what we call fat emboli, big blobs of fat getting stuck in your blood. Like if I poured a lot of olive oil in this bottle, you get a big blob of olive oil and a big blob of water, right? Well, if you had that in your bloodstream, that would cause a heart attack or a stroke. So your body sets up these proteins to keep the particles, fat particles, when we eat them, very, very small so that they don't cause heart attack or stroke or other, what we call emboli. There is like I said, there's an A family, B family, C family, D family, E family. The APOE family has some variations. 1, 2, 3, and 4. 2, in many ways, is supposed to be healthier. 3 is what most of us have. 4 is more of an inflammatory group. If you can look it up, there's a APOE4, there's a sensitivity group or an APOE4 high-risk group on the internet. Now, if you read Dale Bredesen's book, he focuses on APOE4. A lot of focus around APOE4 being a risk for not only heart attack, but especially for dementia. So a lot of focus in that area. And yes, again, short story, Jacob, we do look at that. We do think it's worthwhile taking a look at. In terms of making our work available for the masses, one of the things I had to decide was what did we absolutely had to get for our more bargain basement mass available, mass market available activities, and genetic studies were not one of them. We don't routinely, for example, do genetic studies on our webinars. We don't recommend it on our base price activities, but clearly we've done them. We used to do them in all of our services. Now we do them based on a request. Kofi Adega. Hello, Doc. This is Kofi Adega from Ghana. Thank you so much for telling us where you're from, Kofi, or Kofi. And guess what, Kofi? We've seen people from all over the world, but I don't remember ever hearing or seeing anyone from Ghana. My daughter has been there. I have not been. I'm very interested in the stories that she tells us. With all the interest in nitric oxide supplements, is it not sensible to stick to Dr. Ignaro's list on page 120 of his book? I do actually have a couple of different supplements that I recommend. I personally take one of the beetroot supplements, which is just a simple beetroot supplement off of Amazon. Now, I will tell you there is science out there trying to indicate that some supplements are far better. We did a video on Neo 40 recently, and Neo 40, is it better than the others? They would try to say so in their studies. Do I think the studies are strong enough to say you really have to use Neo 40? Those guys are marketing the dental community really hard for nitric oxide supplementation. I think there's good science to support nitric oxide, making sure you supplement or eat the right foods for nitric oxide. But I don't think that the science supports any one supplement significantly over others at this point. Great question. Thank you, Kofi. Ali Surfyan. Sir, I'm 30 years old with 300 triglycerides and very low HDL 22, while LDL 140. Very interesting, Mr. Sufyan. Again, we have, I've treated and dealt with, as you might imagine, I've treated and dealt with a lot of young people with very high, it's called hypertriglyceridemia. There are about 8 different variations of genetic reasons to have hypertriglyceridemia. Now, it's not that confusing in terms of treating them, but you do need to know what to do and how to do it. So again, look forward to hearing from you, Ali. Kamal. Fermented red rice is good for heart? Question mark. Alan, Indonesia. Thanks for letting us know you're from Indonesia. Yeah, red rice was discovered to be helpful for your heart. And then the big pharma came in and they did what they often do with a lot of things. There's a good side and there's a bad side. They turned red rice yeast basically into statins. That's where statins came from. The original statins came from red rice yeast. Now, what would I do personally? Well, I've got a lot of history and a lot of science behind specific cholesterol-related drugs, and I don't use them for cholesterol anyway. I use them more for inflammation. We've talked about different types. The last one I would use, the one I use the least, is the one that's most popular, atorvastatin, Lipitor. I tend to have used the other ones. And more recently, now that Livalo or pitavastatin has begun to show significant impact on inflammation as well as price, we're headed a lot more in that direction. Prior to that, 2 years ago, the vast majority of the selections were low-dose rosuvastatin. Prior to rosuvastatin losing its patent, we were using more simvastatin, pravastatin, things like that. Jacob Morris is saying red rice yeast is just a statin. Ali Sufyan, so sir, what is your advice on reducing triglycerides? A couple of major things, Ali. One is managing those carbs. Number two is looking at impact on carbs and lifestyle. There's nothing that you can do that's important, that is as important as that. I've already mentioned some of the medications and first of all, more than anything else, like you do with any problem, first understand the cause, assess the situation. Any of you that have ever worked at Toyota know that that's the first part of Toyota's problem-solving activity. First, assess the situation. And that's not just Toyota. There's a lot of folks that understand that's the first thing you need to do. Thank you so much for your interest today. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week.